What is going on? Today is February 7th, 2022. Man, February is flying by, isn't it? And since it's flying by, our awareness of time must also be keeping up. And yeah, there's a lot of time that's needed to be devoted to understanding how the brain works. Trust me, I've started to delve deep into this, and this is quite the journey. I've spent several days on just basic structures of the brain, including the neurons, the second level deeper structures, the glial cells, and just some of the brain organization. So we're still on the frontal lobe, and it's gonna be the case that I'm gonna be in the frontal lobe for quite a bit of time, but that's important because the frontal lobe is pretty much the person, right? It's the most important part of the person because it involves control of the rest of the body, and it involves executive function, right, as I like to call it. So I think we're gonna have some redundancies within the study of the frontal lobe, jumping from section to section, or gyrus to gyrus, or cortex to cortex in the functional sense rather than the anatomical sense. And and I'm probably going to say the same thing multiple times in several videos, so forgive me. I will re-record this series of lectures later on when I have a better organizational understanding of what's going on in all the pieces of the brain. But for now, let's stick with, let's start again by talking about the motor cortexes, right? So first, I think it's better, my understanding also, as time goes on, my understanding refines itself. And I think it's better to, before starting with the cortexes, to talk about the upper and lower motor neurons. Okay, so and I've mentioned those before because those are part of they are involved in the central nervous system. There are neurons that they're not just simply the neurons which are innervated from the peripheral nervous system. They connect to them, and they form different reflex tracts and reflex connection arcs. The motor neurons, remember, control motor movement. So basically any sort of movement that your body, that you want to perform, or that your body has to perform. And the reason there's millions of motor neurons, and there's billions of neurons in general, but the reason that I think are actually a trillion, I don't know, but there's so many motor neurons because there's so much that has to happen in your body simultaneously, in your brain simultaneously, to make a calculated movement within your body, and even uncalculated movement. But let's get to that in a second. So the upper motor neurons are around, they connect to actually this is a better view, they connect to the top of your brain here. And if you remember, in the primary motor cortex, in the motor cortex regions, that's where these upper neurons kind of come from, motor neurons come from. They go all the way down to one of the lower regions through your Cortico Spinal Tract, which is something I'll talk about. And those connect in the Cortico Spinal Tract to lower motor neurons, right? So or they connect to interneurons, which then connect to another neuron. There's several different kinds of connections that can happen within the spinal column, neuron to neuron connections, and I've gone over some of that before when I talked about how the spinal column looks from a cross section of it, right? A top, upper cross section of it, or a frontal cross section of it. So let's and we can even just review that real quickly, like at least in a cross sectional way, right? Like if you look at these regions of the spinal vertebrae, right? They have the gray matter in the center is kind of where the upper motor neurons connect to the lower motor neurons, and the circuit occurs within the body. The neural circuits occur there, pretty much. So let's continue on. And one other thing I'd like to remind you from what I talked about yesterday. Let's go to the primary motor cortex, because the primary motor cortex, which I want to remind you, yesterday contains this homunculus, right? Right, it contains a motor map, which is visually depicted as this weird deformed man here, or little man homunculus. And this homunculus can be mapped along the circumference of the brain to different pieces of the brain. And if you just noticed how the size of the different parts of this homunculus correspond to the number of motor neurons that are available to the brain to control a specific part of the body, like the hand, for instance, is so big because there's so many motor neurons that are needed to control all the different functions of the hand. And the same with the face, too. So the primary motor cortex, again, is responsible for the control of these different distal limbs of the body, and the arms and the face, and the trunk in certain areas. So anytime that you move any part of your tangible or noticeable part of your body, you have activated your primary motor cortex to send information down through your corticospinal tract, or in the case of your face, through your cortical tubular tract, and initiate an action sequence. So that's the primary motor cortex, and I'm definitely going to revisit that when it's broken down, because that's just like a high-level view of it. Then we go into the premotor cortex. Okay, so the primary motor cortex is part of a very large part of the frontal lobe. So anterior to the primary motor cortex, which lies anatomically on the precentral gyrus or postcentral gyrus, there comes the premotor and supplementary motor cortex. Okay, so this is important because this supplementary motor cortex is responsible for planning, coordination of movement. So that's a lot, and that's a lot that goes on. That's a lot to take in, right? Because if the primary motor cortex is related to voluntary muscle movement, right, of every kind of limb listed here, right, and section listed here, like in the case of the trunk, the premotor cortex is associated with things like, responses to a specific stimuli. Okay, so or kind of planning how you respond to a specific stimuli. So the premotor cortex is actually, it's interesting because we don't also understand completely what the premotor cortex in the supplementary motor area does, but it's it'll do things like cue up muscle memory, right? So the neurons in the premotor cortex can be tuned to specific actions and responses. So it's essentially a form of training. When you are performing a sport, which you've trained a significant amount for, and you're relying on your muscle memory to execute actions in that sport, you are activating stored sections of your premotor cortex to kind of communicate with your primary motor cortex to execute an action, right? So there's reciprocal connections between these two areas of the brain, and technically three, because the top is the supplementary motor area, the bottom is the premotor cortex. I believe so. I believe that's the breakdown, or it's the other way around. Whatever the case is, this whole section here can make sense with this section here, which then, again, I talked about the corticospinal tract, right? The corticospinal tract is basically, the majority of motor neurons, distal motor neurons, distal upper motor neurons connect, so they can control the distal limbs, right? And they also control a number of other voluntary muscle functionality and communication. So that is all kind of integrated in the motor cortex region, which consists of communication between primary motor cortex and the premotor cortex and somatosensory cortex and supplementary modal area. There's those four that it seems that we have to know to understand how motor control occurs in the body. Right? And so we'll break down each of those in subsequent videos, and I will talk about the corticotubular tract in another video as well, because the corticotubular tract, this is a good representation. There's not quite the homunculal representation in here, but the corticotubular tract will control facial and head muscles, which obviously are important because if you need to move your head or face, if there was damage or lesions in the corticotubular tract, right, what would happen, and people look at this for like clinical reasons, you'd see paralysis of the face and the head and the neck. So you don't want that, but you'd probably be able to move the rest of your body. You could probably, like, there'd be probably oddities with that the appearance of that. And this is all other structures that we have to learn about. So I think that's it for today. That was quite a lot. Have a good day. See you later, and keep your brain active.